Howdy, Toastmasters. Welcome to Storytelling, sponsored by Wordweavers. Tonight we have a stable of 5 amazing storytellers who will entertain you with their tantalizing tales of the American West. Yeehaw! We're going to start out with Larry Crackle. Larry is a professional storyteller with a wide repertoire of tales. Laurie will now present a humorous tall tale of early Wyoming. Larry Crackle, Mule Egg. Take it away, Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Way back in 1850, Darrell Dalrymple lived in Chicago. He had this big house. He was a rich man. He was in accounting. He had his own accounting firm, and he worked downtown Chicago, which was a dirty place. And it was not only dirty in the air, they had the mafia and the mob and everything. He just got sick of it. So one day he just decided he was going to pull up stakes and move to someplace new. He was going to Wyoming. So he bundled up all his kids and put all his belongings into these big trunks and run them back up there on the train, and off they went to Wyoming. Chunk, chunk, clickety click, clickety click. Woo, woo. I should have got my whistle. Man, what was I thinking? Anyway, along they went, and away they went, and away they went, and they went across North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and Wyoming, and they went here and they went there, and they were getting closer to way out in the outback, and to get exhausted with all that traveling. I just couldn't figure out. But the scenery was changing, and wouldn't you know it, they got into Wyoming, where the buffalo roam. Yeah, and the deer and antelope play. They got into about Gillette, somewhere around Gillette, and he told them, "Stop the train, we're getting off." And they had no idea where they were. The conductor stopped the train, and they just threw all the trunks out onto the platform, and he went down the street to some real estate place and says, "You got a farm to sell around here?" And yeah, the guy says, yeah, we got a farm. It's the people just up and left. It's all fully furnished, has all the implements and everything, but no animals. Oh, we could figure that out. So they hired some buckboard guy to take them out to their ranch there and got settled down. And he decided he needed some mules and some cows and things like that. So he hoofed it on over to the nearest rancher. Yeah, he was headed over there. He got his cowboy hat on. He was really acting pretty cool. He was in Wyoming. And so that rancher saw him coming, and he says, "Oh, greenhorn, I can spot a greenhorn a mile away. This is going to be fun." So Darrell Dalrymple, he walked up and he offered, "I'm looking for mules. I'm looking for cows. I'm looking for anything that goes on ranches, dogs, horses, whatever. But I really need a mule because I know I need to plow up the back 40. This old hayseed guy, he says, "Well, I haven't got any mules, but I have one mule egg left." Mule egg? Yeah, that's how they do it out here. Mules lay eggs. And yeah, but I have one. I'll sell it to you for $2. Well, that seemed pretty high. So Darrell, he kind of jewed him down. They bartered and got it down to $1. So the old hayseed goes into the house. He says, "Yeah, it's my wife's keeping it incubated in the kitchen." So he comes back out, brings this mule egg back out here. And here you go. Here's your mule egg. Now, what you have to do is you have to sit on this thing for about 6 weeks and you incubate it. It's been incubated for a couple of weeks, but yeah, this is the mule egg, and you'll get a nice fine mule out of it. Daryl thought that's a pretty good deal. I got this mule leg for $1. So he went on home. He was just happy, trotting along, just walking. He comes into the house and he says, I got a mule, but we have to hatch it. And so he shows his wife this mule leg. And she says, Daryl, you stupid fool. That's a coconut. Oh, no, it's mule. Dear, we're not in Chicago anymore. Things are different out here in the country, and you just got to fit in. So we're going to hatch this. So they stuck it in the easy chair and put some pillows over it, and they took turns sitting on that thing. But it was, no matter what they did, they could not be comfortable on that. 5 weeks went by, and yeah, it was just, nothing was happening. It was warm, but they'd shake that thing. Nothing in it. Didn't sound like there's any. It was kind of sloshy in there a little bit, but that was it. Well, Daryl, he got out in the barn there and he worked on the harnesses, and the kids, they liked playing in the big yard, having a good old time. And it was the wife's turn to be sitting on this mule leg, and her little rump kind of got enough of it. She was sore. And she says, enough of this stupid coconut. I've had it. So she goes out there on the back porch and she takes this old mule leg and she heaves it as hard as she could, and it sailed across the yard out of the bushes. Whoops, I got focus here, too excited. Come on, let's get me back in focus. I guess it isn't going to. And clonk, hit something. Bonk. I got to get back in focus. This is crazy. I'll be right back. Here we go. I'm back. I'm back. And out of those bushes staggered the biggest jackrabbit you ever done seen. Oh man, the kids, they jumped up and down. Ma, the mule leg hatched. It's right here. And they go over and hug that jackrabbit who's just going, oh, he's just kind of dazed, just kind of didn't know what to hit him in the head. And they called the pa, and he comes running out of the barn, and he takes that old mule, and I got the mule leg. I told you, my wife, we hatched that mule leg. And he hauls it over to the barn, by the ears, dragged it over there and hooks up to the harness and the plow. Well, that jackrabbit came to finally. Yeah, he had stars in his eyes, but he finally got his bearings and he was out of there. He just took off one big leap with that plow behind him, Daryl Dalrymple holding on to that thing, and he steered it out into the back 40. And that every leap that jackrabbit took, it took him up in the, Daryl was up there, but every time it come down, boom, it hit a furrow about 50 feet long, and up and down, around, up and down. That jackrabbit was the best mule you ever saw. In no time at all, he had that back 40 all plowed. It didn't look pretty, but it was plowed. Well, the old jackrabbit was so exhausted, he just kind of sat there and heaving and whatever. And well, Dalrymple was pretty exhausted too. And he took one hand off of the plow and he wiped his forehead, and that jackrabbit saw that and thought, oh, this is my chance to escape. And he took a leap. Fortunately, Daryl got his hand back on the plow, and that jackrabbit was heading for the sagebrush, but he took a leap over the barbed wire fence, and that plow caught onto that barbed wire fence, and boing, it come to a big stop. That jackrabbit knew he had been had, so he just gave in. So Daryl, he just pulled that plow and pulled the harness to the jackrabbit, and they went back to the barn. He put the plow away, and he put the jackrabbit in a stall so it couldn't jump out. It was a full stall like in a horse stable. And God, he was so proud. He was sure exhausted. And his wife just shook her head. But the kids, they said, hey, Pa, we see those little ones hopping around everywhere. They're all over the place. We didn't know that those were mules. And his Pa says, well, go get me some. Well, they took off into sagebrush and they came back holding several of them by the ear. You know what he did? He put them in the stalls too, and he started feeding them. The kids loved them. You know how kids are, and gave them all names, and they tamed quite a few of them. So pretty soon he had a big, all kinds of mules. They had jackrabbit mules that could haul plows and do harrowing, and he even figured out how to hook them up to a wagon. But he didn't have them jump all at one time, because that'll lag. A couple times he was up there on the seat, and those jackrabbits took off, and he was thrown clear back into the back. So he kind of syncopated. He got them staggered, so they were just kind of, all of them were going at different times. And he go into town, and people look at him and they couldn't believe their eyes. What was going on? Well, they had one frisky male buck, and he was just as bad as the original one. And he got loose, and he took off across the sagebrush, and he didn't know anything about other jackrabbits. He was domesticated, but he found some antelopes, and he chased off the male antelope, and he had himself a harem. And so when there's babies came back the next spring, and they were a cross between a jackrabbit and an antelope. That's where you heard the term jackalope. Yeah, that's where it came from. And well, they went out, the kids there, and they got those jackalopes, and they thought, oh, this is pretty good. We have a new species. So they got them in there, and they loved them up and gave them names, and they trained them, and they were a whole lot better. They weren't so crazy as the jackrabbits. So they could haul a wagon pretty good. They went into town, and people just go, what is going on out there? This is crazy as crazy it could be. And they tried to get rabbits and tame them, but they did not figure that out. But oh yeah, Mr. Darrell Dalrymple, he really became successful. He bought up a couple other farms, and even if you go back to Wyoming right now, you can go back there. This is the northeast corner. You can't, there's hardly any. There's Gillette. I have a buddy in Rosette there, but you go back in the northeast corner, there's hardly anybody back up in there. But they do have the original farm, the original family. The Dalrymples are up there. And they got into doing cows and stuff like that, but they still keep the original jackalopes. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you, Larry. All right. Our next storyteller is Reba Murray. Here to share a story of Miss Annie Oakley, the Wild West legend, is a campfire queen herself. Please welcome Reba Murray. And her speech title is Aim at a High Mark, the story of Annie Oakley. Reba, you're up.
Howdy. Name's Reba. Reb for short. Rebecca for long. Also known as the Campfire Queen. But I'm not a pyro. Well, maybe I am. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about me. I'm here to share a story with you. A story that changed my life, and I'm sure it'll change yours too. That night, when the moon was bright and the stars were out, I was sitting around, of course, a beautiful campfire with my friends Jim Beam, Jimmy Dean, and Emmylou Harris, singing a song. Even cowgirls get the blues sometimes, when all of a sudden the embers started glowing. The smoke started growing and a figure started showing. Emmy Lou and I wanted to get going. When the smoke cleared, the figure appeared and she said, "Never fear." Actually, she said, "Don't be afraid," but that didn't rhyme. I said, "Could it be? Would it be the one, the only Annie Oakley?" She stood back and looked at me and said, "That's right." Now, some know me as Phoebe Ann Moses, but the world came to know me as Miss Annie Oakley, born in 1860 to my mother Susan, my father Jacob, that lived in West Ohio in a little town called Woodland. I was the 5th living daughter. We see that Susan, my mama, lost one along the way. Now I came into this little town, a little cabin where my daddy, 30 years older than my mama, was trying to make a go of it on this little farm. But just about the time I was about to turn 5.5, my daddy took a full wagon of the wheat that we had grown into town to get ground into flour, and he got caught in a snowstorm we were not expecting. We didn't know if he would make it back alive, and finally at midnight we heard something rolling up, so we all ran outside and we found Daddy frozen solid to the reins, so frozen he couldn't speak. Well, we brought him inside and he never got better. In fact, he died 3 months later. And there was my mama. By that time, there were 7 of us kids. She had 7 mouths to feed. So I thought, "Annie, what can you do to help this family?" And I got my idea. Well, I'd love running around in the forest with the fairies and the creatures. And so I started doing what Papa taught me, to make little traps. You see, I'd trap the little grouse and the little creatures, and I'd kill them because we needed some more to eat. And I'd bring them home and Mama would fricassee them up and fry them up. And I felt so proud adding to the family table. And then one day I got an idea to get my daddy's rifle off the mantle. Now, we were a Quaker family, and shooting guns was, well, it wasn't looked on very kindly. But Mama sort of looked the other way when I grabbed that rifle, and I plowed it so full of gunpowder it could have killed a buffalo. That was my first shot. I learned something there. But I also learned from Daddy that if you're going to shoot an animal, you shoot him clean, right through the head from ear to ear. And I'll never forget that first squirrel. I was watching it so closely as it left its nest, went up along the fence to a little acorn tree, and it grabbed that nut, and as it was running back along the fence, bam, clear through the head. Now, I got so good at this, killing animals and killing all kinds of birds, that we had too much to eat. So I started selling it to the local merchant, and he started selling it to a restaurateur in Cincinnati. And about the time I turned 15 years old, my sister, who got married, moved down there. And everybody knew me because of the way that I shot and delivered these meats. You see, most hunters didn't care like I did. I wanted it clean through the head so that shot didn't get in the body and spoil the meat. And I was the only one who could do that consistently. So on this time, I'm visiting my sister. This dashing man came into town by the name of Frank Butler and his gorgeous standard poodle, George. Now, Frank and George were traveling the country, making all kinds of money from their gun shows. They had all kinds of tricks, like Frank would put George on a stool and George would sit there with an apple right on his head, and Frank would bam, the apple would fall into pieces, and then George would grab those pieces and take them to people in the audience. But a lot of people made a living this way, traveling from town to town, circuses and shows. Vaudeville was big time. Well, I was just 15, but he came into town and the restaurateur said, "You know, we got a sure shot gal in town. why don't you have a little competition with her? I'll put up a purse of $50. $50 in 1875? That was like $500 today. And I thought, well, sure, I'll go for it. Well, clay pigeons were just brand new back then. So they had 25 clay pigeons for Frank Butler, 25 clay pigeons for Phoebe Ann Moses. They'd shoot up a clay pigeon, bam, Frank would get it. Shoot up one, bam, I would get it. On the 25th pigeon, Frank missed. I knew that was my time. And I got 25 out of 25 and went home smiling because I got that purse. But Frank was smiling too because he was looking at me as his future wife. Well, he's 25 years old, 10 years older than me. I didn't care about men, but I did like his dog, George. And Frank took notice of that. So he sent me a beautiful box of candy from George. And I wrote George a nice little thank you note. And then George wrote me back and I wrote him and so on and so forth. And a year later, I married that man, Frank Butler. Then came the chance for me to learn from him all the tricks that he knew. And I took my rifle and all of my guns and I took this opportunity to heart. Frank and I became a show together. I learned how to shoot the ashes off a cigarette out of Frank's mouth, a dime out of his hand, a card in midair, glass bottles, 10 at a time before they hit the ground after jumping over a table, riding bareback, shooting like that, even a mirror like this. You see, I was ambidextrous too. I even could one up this by using the reflection in a knife. Well, we got our opportunity to go big time when Buffalo Bill's Wild West show came to Louisville, Kentucky, and we drove down and auditioned for the show. They took one look at me, watched me shoot, and said, "You're in." And I'd become a star. Traveled all over the United States, even on a steamliner to Europe. I met the Queen Elizabeth herself, and was presented to Prince Edward as well. But I shook her hand first because, you know, ladies first. 17 years of this. I made more in a week than most people made in a year. And that was just from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show alone. That doesn't count all the exhibitions and the contests that I won. And I saved all that money. I was very, very frugal. And that's a lesson for you too. Save for your retirement. I'm telling you right now. And it also allows you to have money to give to others. Why, I paid off my mother's mortgage. I helped all of my family. I helped orphans get a college education. Well, about the time I was turning 40, I was getting real tired of the traveling life. You see, with Bill's Wild West show, we traveled 9 months out of the year. I lived in a tent for all those years. It was a nice tent, but you know, a girl gets tired of living in a tent. So Frank and I, we decided to settle down. And just after that, the most horrible thing happened. One night we were in a big caravan of trains, and the car right in front of us experienced a head-on collision with another train. We were in the second car. We lost 100 horses that night. And that was the night we decided to leave the show for good. But we continued to do our thing in different towns. In fact, I remember one exhibition where 31,000 people showed up to see me shoot against a man. I was almost always shooting against a man. And I'll tell you what, one of my passions became to teach women how to shoot, not only to defend themselves, but also to have some fun with a gun, because guns are fun. I had about 300 of them, so I should know. But I do have a message for you, a message that's very serious. Now, all of a sudden, as soon as Annie said that, that smoke started growing up again, so we could not see her. The vision was obscured. Annie, Annie, do not leave before you tell us your message. The smoke cleared away one last time. Listen closely. Now, you all have heard maybe this quote in books and things that I have said, and it goes like this. Aim at a high mark and you will hit it. No, not the first time or the second, and maybe not even the third. But keep aiming and keep shooting, and you will eventually hit the bullseye of success. Because after all, practice does make perfect. And this is the part that I'd like to clarify, because a lot of people get sort of messed up on the perfection thing. Perfection is in the trying, not the winning. Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you very much, Reba. Our next storyteller is Eileen Beck. Eileen Beck drove up the Alaska-Canadian Highway to Fairbanks, Alaska to work as a registered nurse in the operating room in the year 1978. A lot of professional young people travel to Alaska for a job and adventure. We were there to rock the world. However, Alaska itself shook us up a little bit. The same thing happened to Ann Hobbs, a 19-year-old teacher who was hired for the small school in Chicken, Alaska in 1927. She was there to teach, but she received quite an education herself. You're invited to listen to Ann's story. Get comfortable in your dog sled and hang on to your hats. And here we go with Eileen Beck with the story, Tisha.
Thank you. I was in the race of my life, or the chase of my life. It wasn't on foot. It wasn't on horseback. It wasn't in a hot little car. I was on a dog sled with my friend Fred, and we were chasing the most evil man on the planet with my two kids. He had just kidnapped them. How did this all happen? I couldn't believe in this short while these events occurred. Let me start in the beginning. In 1927, I got a job in Chicken, Alaska as a teacher. I got up there by barge in the Yukon River. Of course, we're mostly in Canada, but then we took a sharp left-hand curve and ended up in Eagle, Alaska. As I was arriving in Eagle, Alaska, everybody was there. This was a town of Indian fishermen and fur trappers, sourdoughs, and gold miners. Everybody in Eagle, Alaska was out. I thought maybe they're here to see the new girl in town. Not really. That barge brought supplies, it brought food, it brought letters from home. It may have brought a pretty little material for someone to make a nice little dress. Well, since everyone was in town, there were a couple dances there. I decided to go to a few dances. And there was one guy, his name was Cabernet. I don't know where he got that name. If he liked to drink, why couldn't it be Jack or Dan? But who cares? But anyway, he took a fancy to me and he wanted to marry me right then and there. Well, number one, he must have been 30 years old. That was way too old for me. And I was up there to teach, not to get married. Besides, he gave me the creeps. Now, I need to still go to Chicken, Alaska. That was about 100 miles down south. And how they moved things from the barge to these little villages was by horses or by dog sled. Now, Mr. Strong had a bunch of horses and he was taking a lot of stuff down to Chicken. And I was the one thing off the barge I was going down by horseback too. He gave me the biggest horse ever. His name was Blossom and my legs went out nearly doing the splits. Well, going down to Chicken was an adventure in itself. It took about a week to get down there. I finally made it to Chicken, Alaska, and I was ready to teach. Now, a lot of people were excited to see me because they wanted their kids to pass 8th grade, so perhaps they can go on to high school in Fairbanks or Anchorage. They kind of want to get their kids out of there. Then a lot of people really didn't see the need for school. And they thought I was bringing highfalutin ideas that they really didn't need. A good deal of the town was white people. Some of them had Eskimo or Native American wives there. Most of the Indians or the Eskimos lived out in the outskirts. Now there's one young man I really kind of liked. His dad was white and his mother was Eskimo, and they lived right there in Chicken, Alaska. He was my age and everything clicked with us. He was a good listener, and he also helped me figure out how to live in Chicken, Alaska. We went to a few dances and had fun, but guess who arrived? Good old Cab himself. And Cab really did not like me hanging out with someone who was Eskimo. What Cab didn't know is my grandmother was Cherokee Indian. So I really wasn't a pure-blooded white person myself, as he thought I was, even though my hair was blonde. I didn't think I'd bring this up because I didn't want to infuriate Cab. But Cab was so jealous of Fred that one time he picked a fight with them and beat poor Fred up. I said, Fred, I like that you are a pacifist. That's great. You got to defend yourself. And Fred said, you know, no matter what I do, Cab will, everyone kind of favored Cab. So let's just leave it be. Well, as much as I like Fred, that part I was a little scared of. But anyway, while I was teaching, like I say, some people liked me, some people didn't. There were these two cute little kids. They really weren't quite ready for school, but they're ragamuffins. Their dad was white, but just deserted him. I saw him all the time, but he had nothing to do with the kids or his girlfriend, so to speak. And the poor mother of these two children she was sick and she was having a hard time making ends meet. And she was shunned by the community. Those kids didn't have a chance. The other problem was, well, then their mom died. So I thought, I'm adopting these two kids. You know, they're cute, I like them, they need a good chance. So I asked the father, since he was, responsible for them, kinda, I said, can I adopt these two kids? And he goes, whatever, go for it. So I did. But the townspeople didn't like a white woman adopting two Native kids, even though they were half white themselves. They thought it ruined my reputation. And I wasn't worried about my reputation. If they really knew, I was really more like the Indian kids than the white people. But anyway, people took a fuss to it. So one day I came home and I left the kids at home. I didn't worry about things back in 1927. And the kids were gone. Oh my God. And the clothes were gone. Some of their toys were gone. Oh, someone has taken them. I kind of think Cab was up to his old tricks there. What happened? Then Mrs. Carey from next door came in and said, oh, what are you fussing about? And I said, someone has kidnapped my kids. What did you see anything? You were here. What happened? So, oh yeah, Mr. Vaughn and one of the ladies over there and Cab took them. And I said, you're kidding me. And she said, you're better off without him. I said, don't you give me that crap. Oh, where are those kids? And she kept on saying, you're better off without them. And I told her, I'm leaving and I'm not coming back to the school until I find those two kids. And she says, you can't. We got to get these kids, our other kids, graduated out of 8th grade to go to high school. I said, well, you worry about your kids. I'm going to worry about mine. So I went right to Fred's house and I told him my problems. Fred was not too crazy about going off, running after Cab. But of course, he kind of knew by now, if he didn't make me happy, if I wasn't happy, ain't no one's going to be happy. So he got the dog sleds ready and got the dogs, and off we went to God knows where. Now, dogs don't run on gasoline. We had to fill our sled with provisions for ourselves and food for the dogs. It was a pretty heavy sled because we didn't know how far we're going. But it was that time of year where the snow was melting a bit and that heavy sled was dragging pretty badly into that snow. And the dogs were getting really tired from dragging all that food. And I was trying to run along with the sled. I wasn't adding extra weight in there. So we had to dump a lot of our provisions on the trail. The dogs ran faster, but we kind of worried about what the dogs were going to eat later. One nice thing, there were cabins along the way, so we could stop and get food for the dogs and give them a rest. We stopped at this one cabin, and I came into another snarky woman. I said, "Was Cab here?" And she goes, "No." And I said, "Are you hiding those two kids here?" She goes, "No." And she was just kind of getting my Irish up there, so to say. So then her husband came in, who was a little more reasonable man. I said, "Was Cab here?" He goes, "Yeah, he was here with two kids. And he left about a half hour ago." Well, Fred and I were ready to go off again. So we kept on going and going. There's this one little, it wasn't a little hill, it was a bit of a mountain. We went up, but on the other side was a bit of a cliff. Now, when there was a lot of snow, we could have gone down with that dog sled down that hill, but the snow was melting. Oh, I said to Fred, "We're going down that." He goes, "Oh, no, wait a minute. We have to kind of zigzag here. I would rather go completely around and go down to the valley than go straight down." Well, the good thing about Fred, we compromised. We zigzagged a little, and then we also went to the left a little, where it was more even snow. Well, believe it or not, and we were mushing away, let me tell you. And we finally caught up to Cab. He was going at a moderate pace, and we were going full speed. So Fred's over there with the dogs and says, "Cab, we need those kids. Let us have those kids there." And all Cab said was, "Hey, I'll race you for $1,000. I'll race you down to the end of the valley." Fred says, "We want the kids. We don't want any of your malarkey here." Well, Cab kept on challenging Fred. Well, Fred said, "What the heck? Can't beat him, join him." So he was racing Cab. And we both, sometimes we got a bit ahead, sometimes lagged behind. Then finally, Cab had the much better dogs. So he and the two kids went way ahead of us. Oh, we had to stop and regroup. Fred says, "I'm not too sure if we can catch up with Cab." And I said, "Don't worry, Cab has to stop someplace." What I was worried about, though, and Cab had mentioned it before, he was going to give these two kids to a native fishing village. And he would say to them, "If you give those kids to that woman, I will never bring supplies up here again." So he was threatening them. I said, we got to get Cab before they go to that village. So we were going along like crazy. And then all of a sudden we see Cab with his dog sled stationary. The dogs were kind of like this, just resting. And the two kids were looking around, looking kind of scared. And we caught up to Cab. So I just got right up there and took the little girl. Her name was Ethel. Took Ethel, put her in the sled. And Cab started yipping at me. "You can't do that. You should not have these native kids." I said, "No one else wants them. I'm taking them." And then I took the little boy. His name was Chuck. Got him in the sled. And then Cab, he wasn't going to beat me up because he still wanted to marry me, but he started beating up on Fred. Oh, no, here we go again. Fred doesn't defend himself because he doesn't believe in fighting. So bam, bam, and poor Fred was getting a beating. Then all of a sudden, there's a spark of light or electricity in Fred. He got up and got to Cab and whammed right on the nose, then ran right up the jaw. He was pulmoning, poor Cab. And so Cab was now unconscious on the ground, blood all over. I got the kids in the dog sled, and neither one of us really wanted to be charged with murder. So we decided we'd first make sure Cab was okay. And he came to, and we stuffed, cotton and stuff up his nose to stop the bleeding, put stuff in his mouth to stop the bleeding. Then all of a sudden, Cab was acting like a civilized human being. He goes, "Well, little lady, I just didn't want to see your life ruined by these two kids, but you know what? You show some spark. You're a real Alaskan." And he said, "Fred, I didn't know you had it in you, but you're a real tough guy." And he was doing all this stuff. Well, we thought Cab was being very nice. Maybe he had seen the light. Maybe he had a bad head injury. Who knows? But what he was doing, he was stalling us. because he was planning, that's why he was stationary there. He was going to meet two Indian fur traders, or trappers, I should say, and they were going to pick up the kids. And soon enough, the two Indian fur traders came up and they were telling me they needed the kids. They should be raised in an Indian village. And I said, well, where were you when their poor mother was suffering? Well, they didn't talk about that. Then all of a sudden they're talking about tribal laws and the US Constitution. It was like two Supreme Court justices arguing. And I thought, they don't talk about this all the time. Cab, you know, he told them what to say. Well, finally, thank goodness. And because I don't think they want to hit a lady, they just gave up on me. And Cab did too. So we got those two kids in the sled and off we went. Man, that was just something. I was exhausted, but thank goodness I had those two kids with me. But there's just one more thing. I know it's getting kind of late, but I got to tell you one more thing about the wilds of Alaska. One of the mothers, one lady who we met on the way in one of her cabins as we were stopped, she said, you know, I really feel bad for you losing those two kids. My own daughter has just got married. She's got a baby and they're out there someplace. I haven't heard from her. So I go, oh, yeah, we'll keep an eye out for her. But we thought we probably wouldn't see her. You know, Alaska is so vast. So we were going along, you know, the snow's melting. All of a sudden we were kind of going into holes and wondering what this is all about. Well, some of the snow was melting and there were potholes around and we had to get the dogs out and it was a mess. And then one time we were walking around, just seeing where to go. We kind of scout, make sure the trail was good. And there was this big old hole there. And we looked down and there was Elmer. Now, Elmer's the husband of the lady that we were looking for. And he didn't look too good. In fact, he looked kind of dead to me. Oh, that was awful. And then there was Jenny right above him. She wasn't looking so good either. I thought, oh, here I got my two kids, but I'm going to have to report to Jenny's mother that she no longer has her daughter. And then we were looking for the baby too. Well, the good thing, I mean, Elmer did not make it, but the good thing, as we were trying to move people around, see, you know, what's the best thing to do with them, Jenny kind of came back to life. She started breathing again. She started whimpering and we couldn't find the baby, but we found out that the baby was kind of wrapped up with her. So the baby wasn't looking so great, but kind of pale, but not frozen. But poor Jenny's foot was black. It was so frozen. So we wrapped up Jenny, put her in the sled. Here I got two kids, a baby, and then Fred. So we made it to a village. But the village wasn't, you know, they said, you know, we can't take care of this poor woman. So good old Fred, you know, he had a lot of work to do, but, you know, he was so good to me. He got her back in the dog sled and took her to a hospital. And the great thing, Jenny lived. That was fantastic. But he left me behind with two kids and a baby. So things did work out. And that was my last year working at Chicken. I only worked 1 year as a teacher there. Then I moved up to Eagle because they had a bigger school and there are just more things to do. And they kind of liked me better up there. But I kept my two kids. And the other thing, in a couple of years, I married Fred. That was the best thing. Never thought I'd find romance someplace way out in Alaska. But I married him and we adopted 6 more kids. So everything worked out well. But that was the race of my life, Mr. Toastmaster.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Our next speaker is Matthew Hartman. And now for something entirely different. Picture this, Mish, a Western steampunk fantasy story. Are you curious yet? Good. Matthew Hartman has loved fiction since he was a small child. Listen as he introduces a taste of a fictional world that he is working on and intends to create a book series of. The people of the kingdom of Zarn live in a world ravaged by disaster that has turned their lush home into a desert full of danger and mystery. Legends will arise in the future, but before then, it all started with a horse. Matthew Hartman, the horse.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow Toastmasters, honored guest. The winds blew heavily as the man rode along sand dunes. His goggles glinted in the light, despite the efforts of his wide-brimmed hat to block out the sunlight. The trader had promised that the horse was among his best. But the man wasn't so sure about that. After so many miles on the road with that old nag, the old nag had proven to be stubborn, but content to try to eat any shrub she could find along the way to their destination. The man sighed as the sun beat down on man and horse alike as they slowly continued along. I never should have trusted anyone in that damn saloon, the man thought as he wondered if there was even anything out there. Despite his skepticism, Jack Ryder was always on the lookout for the next opportunity. He had grown up hearing stories about Zarn City, but was never quite sure what to make of it, having never been there. Zarn was said to be the one beacon of civilization in a swath of still fertile land in an otherwise unforgiving world. The people in the capital could never understand what it was like for people like him. While they enjoyed fancy lives thanks to modern technological wonders, people in the outlands lived a rugged life in an unforgiving desert. The desert covered the western half of the continent in what had once been a lush paradise generations ago. Jack didn't know anything about that beyond stories of the hubris of man in thinking he can control destiny itself. Whatever the people of the Kyrian Empire had actually done to mess things up had made life difficult for everyone else. Besides, he didn't see how anyone could have ever lived out here in this wasteland. Aside from the occasional shanty town, the farther you traveled from one of the handful of major cities on the continent, the more dangerous the environment became. He sighed and pressed the damn nag to stop chomping on a shrub and keep going. How could he have ended up with such a stubborn horse? I bet the guy knew that this horse was stubborn. Asked for a discount on the horse, get the worst one in the world, Jack grumbled to himself before taking a swig of water from his canteen. He had a vague idea of where he was going. There were rumors of a possible dig site somewhere in the vicinity, and he just needed to keep moving forward. What he did wasn't strictly legal, but it was lucrative. Discovered ruins from the Kyrian Empire of old were regularly guarded by local militias. Rather than send guards abroad, the government hired locals to protect the researchers at any given site. Too bad the researchers just wanted to put any relics they found in museums instead of trying to see if anything still worked. It was true that most relics of the past were irreparably broken, but every once in a while, a working piece of Magitech was uncovered that reintroduced one of the comforts of that ancient empire back into the world. Jack passed tumbleweeds and cacti in what was an otherwise barren landscape. It was a long ride on the stubborn nag, but he knew that if he could reach an untapped ruin, that there could be fortune in his future. It better be worth it though, because damn is the sun killing me. Jack wiped sweat from his eyes as he continued to ride along. For a minute, he thought he heard the sound of galloping. He blinked and glanced around his surroundings. In the distance, he saw what had to be a dozen men in the red outfits of the Red Riders militia. One thing was for sure, they weren't friendly. Friendly folk don't brandish rifles at you. Jack urged the nag to go faster. At first, the nag barely moved any quicker than before. That was until a shot rang out. That got the stubborn horse to move. "Hey, stop!" yelled one of the horsemen. No, getting captured by the Red Riders and detained for at least a month was not on the agenda today. Knowing that he had crossed into a red zone was enough for him to realize he was on the right path. The nag coursed along towards the canyon that Jack saw in the distance. He pulled an orb from his belt and turned it a notch. Just as he entered the mouth of the canyon, Jack tossed the orb and it hit the ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the orb flashed white and the mouth of the canyon collapsed behind him, blocking the entrance with rubble. Jack heard shouts of frustration as he continued onwards through the canyon. There was no turning back now. The canyon grew more narrow and overgrown with foliage as Jack continued along the way. He gave a sigh of relief as he noticed an odd-looking wall. He stopped and dismounted the horse to examine it. At first glance, the wall seemed to be just another wall of solid rock, but he recognized faint Kirian runes that suggested something else. There was a depression in the wall, but no apparent key. He tapped at the various runes and depression, but nothing happened. He frowned, unsure of what to do next. Naturally, the nag began to nip at the weeds growing by the wall. Of course he would be hungry, he said. Jack shook his head as the horse continued to eat. That's when he spotted an odd-shaped rock that had been covered by the grass the horse was eating. He picked up the rock and pressed it into the depression. There was a click. The rock wall rumbled and moved to reveal an opening. Jack stepped inside, finding the dark room. At first, nothing happened, but a light flickered and soon he could see an untouched structure. The walls were made of metal and the floor was concrete. Flickering lights that had not been turned on in centuries revealed sealed metal boxes neatly arranged as if waiting for someone to pick them up who had forgotten about them. This room was obviously from the old Kirian Empire and by some miracle hadn't been looted in the past 1,000 years. Jack didn't know it yet then, but the decision to explore this room would change his life forever, all because his discount horse was hungry. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Matthew. And now for our final storyteller, Brad Grinrod. A couple of years ago, Brad heard Odds Bodkin tell the story of Paul Bunyan and the giant mosquitoes, and he was hooked. When I grow up, I want to tell stories just like him, he resolved. Then he realized, hey, he was already grown. So here's Brad Grinrod, who's going to tell a tall tale. Brad Grinrod, a tall tale. Brad, you're up.
All right, thank you, Gary. You know, storytelling goes back a long ways. So does reading, only not as far. And while telling a story requires at least two folks, you, me, and the more the better, reading, even if it's reading a story, can be done by one person in a book. And while that's not as entertaining as listening to a story, well, it's better than nothing, especially when you're sitting out on the farm like they did in the old days when the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away and town was 10. Well, there wasn't a lot to do for entertainment. So they invented the dime novel, which if they were still around today, you find permanent or displayed in a prominently displayed, I should say, in a rack where you stand in line at the supermarket checkout. Now, in the early days of the dime novels, they mostly wrote about American frontiersmen, real ones like Kit Carson and Wild Bill Hickok and their larger-than-life exploits. Later, when they ran out of real-life frontiersmen to write about, well, they started making them up, mostly by newspaper men, who in order to sell more newspapers invented mythological American folk heroes like Paul Bunyan and John Henry and Pecos Bill. Except they didn't really invent them because they'd already been invented by lumberjacks and railroad workers and cowboys who for decades entertained each other by swapping stories about these characters in evenings after work was over in their bunkhouses and railroad camps and lumber camps. Each man in turn trying to make his story more outlandish than the previous ones, which really, when you come down to it, were bragging contests, which in polite society, well, they finally came to be known as telling tall tales. The taller, the better. For instance, in the logging camps up in northern Minnesota, the tall tale of the larger-than-life lumberjack Paul Bunyan was born. Literally. Story goes that when Paul was so big when he was born that it took 5 storks to deliver him to his family. Not only that, he grew up so big so fast that his family had to milk 24 cows every morning and evening just to keep his milk bottle full. Yeah, and when Paul, he grew up so fast that when it rained, it filled up all of the footprints he left from tramping around Minnesota. Well, it formed the 10,000 lakes. See what I mean? Well, anyhow, when Paul Bunyan grew up, he invented logging. Then he and his crew of lumberjacks logged all the timber that built America. Now, what Paul Bunyan was to the lumberjacks, John Henry was to the railroad workers. See, John Henry was a steel driver. He drilled holes in solid rock, pounding on a spiked chisel with a 9-pound hammer. Then they'd fill those holes up with dynamite to blast railroad tunnels through the mountains. Legend goes that John Henry, the strongest and most powerful man to work the rails, won a contest between himself and a new invention at the time, the steam drill. The steam drill drilled 8 inches before it broke down. John Henry, wielding 2 9-pound hammers, one in each hand, drilled 15. Unheard of feat at the time, before he laid down and died. And that left the cowboys, who, not to be outdone by the lumberjacks and the railroad workers, invented their own larger-than-life legend to brag about, which was Pecos Bill, the greatest cowboy that ever was, who was raised by coyotes, once lassoed a tornado with a 50-foot rattlesnake named Shake, and invented the 6-shooter among his other feats. And that's the story that I'm going to tell you tonight, the tall tale of the life of Pecos Bill, the greatest cowboy that ever... Wait a minute, you already know that part. So how's about I start this story off instead when Bill was 2 years old and some claim jumping squatters moved to within 50 miles of his parents' house, meaning the neighborhood was getting a mite overcrowded. So his ma and pa loaded up all their belongings in their covered wagon, including Bill and his 15 siblings, and headed out to the boonies, meaning West Texas, in search of a little more personal space. But as they were crossing the Pecos River, Bill, who was riding in back, was bounced clean out of that wagon and into the river. And it wasn't until that evening, when the family made camp and began counting up kids, that they realized little Bill was missing. So they organized a search, which didn't turn up nothing, because by that time, Bill had floated 60 miles down the Pecos River, having the time of his life. And when he got tired of floating, why, he turned over and swam another 60 miles until he decided it was time to swim to shore, as night was falling on the West Texas prairie and the coyotes began howling at the moon. And when Bill heard that, why, he started into howling too, which instantly alerted the pack. And when that pack of coyotes came up on Bill, why, they looked at him and he looked at them. And well, it just broke their coyote hearts. So they adopted little Bill, raised him as one of their own. And for the next 15 years, Bill had the time of his life being a coyote, chasing prey, howling at the moon, and scratching at fleas. Till one day, Bill, he was taking a drink from the river when this cowboy who was watering his herd of longhorns came up from behind. "Hey," hollered the cowboy, "what are you doing running around out here without no clothes?" When Bill turned around, why, the cowboy instantly recognized him as his long-lost little brother. "Well, I'll be," said the cowboy. "Ain't you my little brother Bill, who we lost while we was crossing the Pecos River?" "Don't reckon," Bill replied, who let out a howl so loud it nearly stampeded the entire herd. "I'm a coyote," he said. "A coyote?" shot back his brother. "Why, you ain't no coyote. Looky here, if you was a coyote, how's come you ain't got no long, scraggly tail? Coyotes, they got long, scraggly tails." And when Bill looked back, sure enough, no tail. Well, maybe so, Bill reasoned, but I got fleas and I can howl at the moon. "Psst, that ain't nothing," pointed out his brother. "Everybody in Texas has fleas and howls at the moon. Besides, you can walk on your own 2 feet, can't you?" "Well, yeah," Bill granted. "And you can talk too. Ain't no coyote can do that. Now quit fooling around. Get some clothes on. It's about time you learned to become a cowboy." Now, you remember I mentioned earlier that in telling these tall tales, whether it's the lumberjacks or the railroad workers, or in this case, the cowboys, each man in turn tries to make his version more outlandish than the previous one. Well, this is the point in Pecos Bill's story where the next man takes over. And as you'll see, things really start to get wild. Now, with Bill's upbringing, the next man continues, being he was raised a coyote and all, you can imagine he had a different perspective than most cowboys, resulting in that he didn't take too well to the learning he was receiving from his brother. It was unimaginative, Bill said, and decided he was going to reinvent cowboying from the bottom up. So off he walked across the prairie, deep in thought. For 17 days, 17 nights, Bill walked in thought, until one day, as he was passing through a narrow rock-rimmed canyon, while he heard a rumble and a rattle so violent, he thought the sides of the canyon was coming down on him. But it wasn't the sides of the canyon. What Bill heard was the rattle of a 50-foot rattlesnake named Shake, who had gotten that large by eating every cowboy that ever crossed his path. And when he saw Bill, why, Shake thought dinner. But what Shake hadn't counted on is that when Bill was a coyote, one of the first things he learned was how to wrestle rattlesnakes. So when Shake moved in, well, the fight was on. For 3 whole days, Bill and Shake wrestled in that canyon, each one in turn getting the better of the other, till finally Bill got a headlock on Shake that he couldn't wriggle out of. And Shake, well, he cried uncle. So Bill let up on him, which is only fair when someone cries uncle. And Shake, he admired that. So from that day on, Pecos Bill and Shake, the 50-foot rattlesnake, became partners. Yes, sir, Bill coiled him up like a rope, slung him over his shoulder, and off they went, walking across the prairie. Well, the next day, as Bill and Shake were walking through another narrow rock-rimmed canyon, all of a sudden, they heard a blood-curdling roar echoing off the canyon walls, which grew louder and louder until finally they came face to face with a gargantuan man-eating mountain lion, who, like Shake before him, had gotten that large by eating every cowboy that crossed his path. And like Shake before him, he was intent on eating Bill. But this time, Bill had a plan. See, one of the inventions that Bill thought up during his tussle with Shake was something he called the lasso. Shake being the lasso. So when that mountain lion charged, Bill, he was already twirling, shaking around in a big old loop, which he tossed over the mountain lion's head, cinching him around the neck. Then he jumped on his back and he rode that mountain lion like a bucking bronco. And from that point on, Bill only rode mountain lions until the day he met the only horse that was ever a match for him, Widowmaker, who got his name for the obvious reason. No man ever rode him and lived to tell about it, except for Bill. Now, this is the point in the story where the next man in the bunkhouse takes over, whose job it is to wrap this story up in as wild a fashion as possible. So once Bill broke Widowmaker, the final storyteller continues the narrative, he and that horse became fast friends. And the two of them, and Shake, well, they decided to go into business together, lassoing cattle, which they got so good at, they once lassoed an entire herd of longhorns all at one time. Till eventually, they'd lassoed so many, it took all of West Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to hold them all. Then the drought came. So bad that all the cattle and the horses and even people were drying up and blowing away. When luck would have it, off to the north, Bill spied a giant tornado, biggest twister ever seen in these parts, which gave him an idea. Now, everyone knew that Pecos Bill could ride anything that ever bucked or broncked. Bill knew it too. So he wrapped up Shake, he coiled him all up, slung him over his shoulder, jumped on Widowmaker. Then all three of them rode north just as fast as they could toward that twister. And when they got to the base of it, Bill uncoiled Shake, stood up in the saddle and lassoed that twister, grabbing it around the spout before turning it north and jumping on, then riding it all the way to Lake Michigan. And when they got there, he lowered that twister down and held it there until it had sucked up all the water out of Lake Michigan. Then he turned it south again toward Texas, where he pulled out his shit shooters and started shooting holes in that twister, turning it into a sprinkling can, a big one, which sprinkled all that water it sucked up over his land, his neighbors, and the rest of the Southwest, saving 3 whole states from the drought, plus half of Oklahoma, before turning it west and jumping off over California, where he hit the ground so hard, the hole he left there turned into Death Valley. Now, you heard me mention the 6-shooter. Well, along with the lasso, Bill invented the 6-shooter as well. He also invented the branding iron, rodeos, cowboy songs, and those big shiny belt buckles that cowboys wear. He was also married 12 times and outlived every single one of his wives, most of them by natural means. But you know, not even legends live forever and must someday go to meet their maker. And when it was Bill's turn, well, he left this earth in a manner that was befitting a man of his character, which came about one day when this city slicker fella came to town. You know the type, fancied himself a bit of a cowboy. Well, when this fella got to town, he walked right into Macy's. Did you know they had a Macy's in Lubbock? Well, I guess they did, because this city slicker, he walked in there and bought himself a pair of Neiman Marcus lizard skin cowboy boots, a Calvin Klein designer Western shirt and pair of jeans, and a spotless white 10-gallon Gucci cowboy hat. And when that feller walked out, Pecos Bill took one look at him, keeled over, and died laughing. And that's the truth.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Thank you to all our storytellers. And now I'd like to open it up for questions any of you may have for the storytellers.
Louise, do you have a question? Unmute yourself, Louise.
Yeah.
I'm good for now, hon. Thank you.
Good job. Good job, Brad.
Mhm.